Did the Smoot-Hawley Act crash everything? And will President Trump's reciprocal tariffs do the same? Hello, member super savers and bond course fans. I hope you're healthy and well. So Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis C. Hawley of Oregon may have a better name recognition than many current members of Congress, even though they both died long ago in 1941. And the single reason for their fame, as many of the lifelong learners in our Diamond NestEgg community know, is that back in 1930, the two Republicans sponsored the Tariff Act of 1930, which seems to be on everyone's lips today under the more familiar shorthand of the Smoot-Hawley Act. But Smoot and Hawley might not be enjoying their posthumous fame, or should we say infamy, all that much. Smoot-Hawley's tariff increases are said to have caused, or at least dramatically accelerated, the Great Depression, as many mass media and social media headlines keep reminding us. What is Smoot-Hawley, the Depression-era act being compared to Trump's tariffs? Or this one, Shades of Smoot-Hawley, Depression Feared. So, as we often do on this channel, let's break down the facts. Here are the three topics that we'll be covering in today's video. 1. Why and when was Smoot-Hawley enacted? 2. Did Smoot-Hawley cause the Great Depression? And 3. What's our perspective and what might this all mean for you and your money? As usual, here's our front of video disclaimer. For a detailed disclaimer, please refer to the end of this video. Let's dive in now, folks. Why and when was Smoot-Hawley enacted? So, the Smoot-Hawley Act was signed into law by President Hoover, a Republican, on June 17, 1930. The Great Depression had begun the previous October in 1929 with Black Thursday and was already in full swing before the Smoot-Hawley Act became law. As you can see here, stock prices were stuck well below their pre-crisis peaks. U.S. industrial production was also falling fast, and unemployment was skyrocketing, bringing hardship and suffering to an ever-increasing number of Americans. Again, depressed stock prices, falling U.S. production, and skyrocketing unemployment, all of this was already happening before the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were enacted. And what Smoot and Hawley and their supporters wanted to do in that situation was to provide some relief to domestic businesses and workers by shielding them from foreign competition. They focused on agriculture and manufacturing, the two main pillars of the U.S. economy in the early 1930s, and increased tariffs on more than 20,000 types of imported goods. The average tariff on these 20,000 imported goods on the list peaked at 59%. But even Smoot-Hawley left almost two-thirds of imports tariff-free. And so the average tariff on all imports, meaning the combination of the goods subject to Smoot-Hawley and all the remaining goods that could still be imported tariff-free, the average tariff on all imports remained significantly lower, at a little bit under 20%. Now, the U.S. at that point had been a high tariff economy for most of its history, and the average tariff on all imported goods even stayed a bit lower than where tariffs had mostly been during the U.S.'s stretch of breakneck industrial development and growth between the Civil War and World War I. But still, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were substantially higher than tariffs had been during the Roaring '20s, and many of our international trade partners took it as an unhelpful move in difficult times, sending the U.S. government formal notes of protest and or enacting retaliatory tariffs. Sounds kind of similar, or? So, we all know how the sad story of the Great Depression continues. A veritable trade war breaks out, the world splinters in more or less isolated trading blocks, and foreign trade shrinks dramatically along with industrial production and wholesale prices, leading unemployment to spike all over the world. Truly a lose-lose situation, like out of an old Greek tragedy. Now, in all the sources that we analyzed, we couldn't find a single voice that supported Smoot-Hawley. Plus, there seems to be a nearly unanimous consensus among economists that these tariff increases weren't helpful. But did they actually cause or dramatically accelerate the Great Depression? The answer may surprise some of you, which leads us nicely to the next section of today's video. Did Smoot-Hawley cause the Great Depression? There was a lot going on in the early 1930s as a perfect storm unleashed its full force of destruction on the U.S. economy. Stock markets were collapsing, prices were falling, banks were failing, unemployment was skyrocketing, economic confidence was disappearing. And as if to add insult to injury, our agricultural heartland in the Midwest was being ravaged by the Dust Bowl, a seemingly never-ending stretch of drought and sandstorms. And that's before we even talk about the almost permanent instability in Europe and Eastern Asia, which didn't help either. You get the picture, but maybe it still was Smoot-Hawley and the ensuing global trade war that gave the economy the final push over the edge and plunged the entire world into the deepest depths of the Great Depression. Many folks might be forgiven for thinking so, given the never-ending stream of sometimes alarmist headlines that have been constantly flickering on our screens for the past few days, linking Smoot-Hawley and tariff increases more generally with trade wars and economic depression, like these ones that we shared with you at the beginning of this video. But many professional economists and historians aren't so sure. After all, imports in 1929 were only 4.2% of the U.S. GNP, and exports were only 5%. And with these relatively small numbers, international trade in the 1930s may just not have been big enough to make a difference either way. For comparison, the current numbers for the U.S. are more like 16% of GDP for imports and 11% of GDP for exports. In fact, most economists seem to agree that Smoot-Hawley's impact was probably not that decisive after all. This may surprise many of us, so let's introduce an unsuspecting witness for this conclusion, Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman was not only a widely read and generally Trump-critical columnist for the New York Times from 2000 to 2024, he is also the 2008 Nobel Prize winner in economics for his work on international trade patterns. So, in his regular column, The Conscience of a Liberal, Krugman wrote this piece in March 2016, when Trump was running for president for the first time on a platform of raising tariffs. Here's what Krugman had to say. But didn't the Smoot-Hawley tariff cause the Great Depression? No, there's no evidence at all that it did. Yes, trade fell a lot between 1929 and 1933, but that was almost entirely a consequence of the Depression, not a cause. And across the political aisle, the generally libertarian and pro-free trade Cato Institute for once agrees with Krugman's analysis. Even more surprisingly, perhaps for the non-specialists, the general conclusion of quantitative economic historians who have explored the effects of 1930s protectionism is that it had less impact than was traditionally thought. The point is straightforward. The collapse in gross domestic product during the Great Depression was so large that on its own, it can explain the bulk of the trade collapse of 1929 through to 1933. There is relatively little left over to explain the decline in trade. So the point from both Krugman and the Cato Institute is straightforward. When the economy is collapsing and demand is disappearing, demand for foreign goods will automatically shrink along with the rest of GDP. People who struggle to buy their daily meal won't ask for French cheese in the local shop. And that's true with or without tariffs or a trade war. Krugman, by the way, thinks that this conclusion applies beyond just Smoot-Hawley and the Great Depression. He strongly believes that extra tariffs, or even trade wars for that matter, don't generally cause recessions on their own. And the reason for this in a nutshell is that the goods that have been imported before would generally still be needed in their country of destination, and that domestic companies will try to fill this demand as good as they can, sometimes with very similar products, sometimes with as close as possible substitutes. So, for example, and assuming the economy isn't in free fall, if German cars become too expensive in the US after tariffs, many people may just switch to a product from Detroit, even if they wouldn't have considered an American-made car before. And if people can't afford imported bananas that are tariffed, they may, grudgingly, just buy more Georgia peaches. or Washington State apples instead to get their daily dose of fruit. Now, Krugman also wants to make sure he's not seen as supporting high tariffs, trade wars, or protectionism in general. Okay, I'm sure some people will start shouting, Krugman says protectionism does no harm. But no, protectionism in general should reduce efficiency and hence the economy's potential output. But that's not at all the same as saying that it causes recessions. So to summarize, Smoot-Hawley, according to both liberal economists like Krugman and conservative free traders like the Cato Institute, didn't cause the Great Depression, nor did it probably have too much of an impact on how it developed either. In fact, high tariffs, like other protectionist measures, may not cause that much short-term damage on their own if you follow Krugman. There may be some inflationary pressure as less efficient domestic firms step in to fill the gap left by foreign products, but nothing too catastrophic as long as the economy doesn't go into freefall. That said, in the long run, high tariffs can be very harmful. They can carry the risk of shielding domestic producers from foreign competition a bit too much, making the companies lazier and less innovative, which may depress long-term economic growth and wealth for everyone, which is a great segue into the next section of today's video. What's our perspective, and what might this all mean for you and your money? Tariffs and their impact on consumers and the economy as a whole can be complex topics, even for professionals who've been studying them for decades. And what people think about tariffs can change over time. For example, our two main political parties have literally switched their attitude on tariffs a few times over our history. After the Civil War, Republicans initially started out as the party of high tariffs, and it was FDR, a Democrat, who started bringing tariffs down after he won the presidency in 1932. But then it switched again, and Ronald Reagan, a Republican, started making a forceful argument for free trade and the long-term benefits it could bring in the 1980s. Until in more recent times, it's President Trump who is moving the Republican platform back to high tariffs, as we are just experiencing. And for those of you who've watched this recent video of ours on President Trump's reciprocal tariffs and the advantages and disadvantages of tariffs in general, link below for those of you who may be interested, you may remember from that video this illustration on the three primary scenarios I have in my head on how the current tariff situation may play out. And specifically, we personally think this is likely scenario. The key thing to remember is that this time, we as a country are negotiating from a position of strength, regardless of whether we're talking about software, banking, media, etc. We're not coming at tariffs during a Great Depression like Smoot-Hawley. So that's at least one positive, I suppose. Plus, given that we have been running a large trade deficit, meaning we buy more from others than they buy from us, some other countries may have more to lose if we don't buy all their products than we do with our much smaller export volumes. Or at least that's how I see it. And as I've talked about before on this channel, we will probably continue to see much more volatility before we get there, as we're already experiencing. And it may be a bumpy and scary ride with retaliations and escalations, as well as dramatic market movements and everything else. And it seems that China is the country to watch on that front, probably to no one's surprise, as we've seen from their more assertive language and aggressive use of retaliatory tariffs. And it may get worse before it gets better. Who knows? That said, my working expectation currently, or you could call it hope, remains that in the end, everyone can reach a compromise that they can more or less live with, somewhat like where Canada and Mexico ended up after their negotiations in February and early March. And maybe these compromises start with our allies, and only then the US and our friends jointly approach China. That's one scenario. There are many others. In any case, a part of the compromise out of these negotiations might well be that both domestic and foreign companies may build out their manufacturing base in the US again, as many have already announced that they would do. And yes, this may also mean that some products might get a bit more expensive for us consumers here in the US, which is exactly what happened in the 1980s when Japanese car companies brought some of their production onshore to the US to avoid an all-out trade war. But, of course, I could be wrong without my crystal ball, and it could all turn out completely differently. Drop a comment below. How are you thinking about higher tariffs? Do you think they might hurt or help the U.S. economy more? Not just in the short term, but also in the long term. Now, of course, many of our country's trading partners are not happy with President Trump's reciprocal tariffs. Why would they want to change the rules when the current system of tariffs works quite well from their perspective? And this is very understandable. Similarly, many companies and we as both consumers, bondholders, and investors may be unhappy as well because it's all super disruptive and will cost money to implement and may lead to higher costs for all of us. But if you take a long-term perspective, there's always reason for hope. Remember that for-profit companies can be very smart in how they innovate and gain market share. Those that learn how to navigate the new world of tariffs, innovate, and become more productive and efficient will survive. And those that don't, won't. To be clear, I'm not saying that I love the uncertainty and volatility either, but these higher tariffs in some shape or form will happen if I'm correct, because President Trump seems to have a deep conviction on tariffs. And by the way, it's also the platform he campaigned and was elected for. In any case, the tariff outcome is out of our hands, but what's in our hands is how we want to make the best out of the situation and manage our money, which after all is the focus of this channel. Let the recent market ups and downs be a reminder to you about how much you care about stability and predictability in your portfolio. For those of you who are more equity focused, check out these two latest recession videos here to see what approach may be for you. And no, the answer is not try to time the market. It almost never is, as our Diamond NestEgg regulars know. And for those of you who are more bond-focused or who want to learn more about how to build a stable, predictable income stream in times of market uncertainty and volatility, then check out this video here on our bond courses. And come join today's special live member Q&A happening at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time. We'll be talking about the latest moves in bond yields and how we're thinking about things right now. I've also linked all the details on our bond courses and YouTube Super Saver membership below this video for your convenience. All right, members, super savers, and bond course fans, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. And as always, stay tuned for the latest updates on tariffs, bonds, and all things money. See you again very soon with more brand new wealth building content for your financial journey.